program like this to scale? There are many programs. These figures are clearly very outdated. Crianza Feliz has been growing so quickly that when I got the data on 233 families, by now it's obviously more than twice that. But the point is that many countries have taken the inspiration from these small-scale pilots, like the one in Jamaica, to try to implement policies like this at a much larger scale. And we really need to know whether what we saw in Jamaica also works at scale. Most of these programs, Crianza Feliz is an exception. It has an evaluation, but the results, because it only started now, the results are not yet available. Most of these programs have not been evaluated in the way that the Jamaica pilot was evaluated. So most of these programs, we can only just assume that they're going to work well because we have no impact evaluation that will allow us to see that. But there are some where there are some of these impact evaluations, and I want to focus on one that I've worked on myself. A new government in Peru, elected maybe now 8 years ago, decided it was going to create a home visiting program like Crianza Feliz. They didn't really know what they wanted to do. They had promised a home visiting program, an early childhood program. They knew they wanted to reach 480 of the poorest municipalities in the country. But the program didn't exist yet. So we worked with them in the design of the program, but we also convinced them of the following. There are 480 municipalities. They did not have the institutional capacity to launch a program in 480 municipalities. It was simply not feasible. It was not feasible for them in the first year to reach 480 municipalities. Rather, what they said is we want to reach these 480 municipalities by the end of the 5-year term of the government. Okay? So what we did is that we randomly assigned those municipalities that got the program in year 1, or in year 2, or in year 3, 4, and 5. So then it's just like the Jamaica case. We can compare municipalities in which children, when they were young, received the program early, with other municipalities that did not receive it until substantially later, but we know that on average, both groups of municipalities are the same because they were the same at baseline. Everybody more or less understand? That's the logic. That's what you need to do to have a convincing impact evaluation. And here what we found, we evaluated the impact of the program on cognitive development, language, personal social development, and motor development. And what we found is that the program had an important effect. On average, a child who received the program moved from the 50th to the 57th percentile of the distribution of child development. So 50th is an average child. So on average, those children that received the program moved from the 50th to the 57th percentile. They didn't move to the 90th percentile, but nor did they stay at the 50th percentile. Now I should say, these effects are a lot smaller than what we had found in Jamaica. They were only about 20% of the size of what we found in Jamaica. And that again shows the importance of really thinking through what does it take to bring a program to scale. And in fact, we found, and I suspect you'll find the same kinds of difficulties in programs here in Brazil, what we found is that many households that were supposed to receive home visits never received them. There were problems along the line whereby these households, even though they were supposed to receive the visits, didn't receive them. Even amongst those who received the visits, many received many fewer visits than they were supposed to receive. And finally, we had a measure of the quality of the visits. A visit is only effective if the visitor, the home visitor, can establish a good rapport, a good relationship with the mother, and then work with the mother on a series of things that we hope the mother will then continue on doing when the visitor isn't there. And in many cases, this was not done. The quality of the visits themselves was much less good than what had been anticipated in at least some of the visits. So what this shows is that a program like this, and probably a program like Crianza Feliz as well, there's a challenge for when you launch a program at massive scale. How do you make sure that as you roll out this program on a massive scale, how do you make sure that the quality of what you're delivering is in fact of the quality, is in fact like the quality of what you would like to deliver. How do you ensure that? That's what I have to say about home visiting programs. Now I'm going to talk very briefly about cash transfer programs. Cash transfer programs are like Bolsa Familia. So the question is, does a program like Bolsa Familia, does it have the potential to improve child development outcomes? Bolsa Familia on its own, not Bolsa Familia with Crianza Feliz or Bolsa Familia with something else, just Bolsa Familia. Right? And at least in principle, one might think that it could, because as I showed you before, there are these big differences by income in the development of children at young ages. So you might think that making these families somewhat less poor would allow them to invest in their children and therefore actually improve child outcomes. In fact, the evidence, this just shows that many countries in the region, like Brazil, have large-scale cash transfer programs. In fact, the evidence is somewhat mixed on these, on these programs. We have two convincing evaluations of programs like Bolsa Familia, and we find that in general, these programs improve child outcomes in the short run, but in at least some of the cases we have, these improvements do not last in the medium term. And it probably has to do with the fact that the early investments that families make when they receive the cash transfer are not sort of sustained over time as these children age. So once again, so there's a challenge of how to make sure that things that we find on a small scale actually work on a large scale. The last set of interventions I want to talk about are daycare and preschool. Daycare is like creches, so children normally 0 to 3. Preschool, preescola is normally, in most countries, for children 4 and 5 years of age. Now here finally, I do have some data on Brazil. So this is the expansion, the proportion of children 0 to 5 years of age who are in some form of center-based care. Center-based care is creches or preescola. And what you see is that there's been sort of a dramatic increase in the proportion of children, nationally speaking, who are in some form of center-based care, both in Brazil as well as, I put as a comparison, Chile, which is a country that often does quite well on these kinds of programs. This here is the same graph, but now we've broken it down by the age of the child. The orange line is children who are 1 year old. The yellow line is for those who are 3 years of age, and the green line is for children who are 5 years of age. And what it shows basically is that the coverage of preescola is much higher than the coverage of creches. Okay? That's the first thing. And the final graph here is an interesting graph because it focuses on coverage, so how many children are in these services, but separating by socioeconomic status. In fact, the blue line is the line that corresponds to children in families in the richest socioeconomic quintile, so the 20% of richest families, okay? And the orange line corresponds to families in the poorest 20% of the income distribution. So let's look at the bottom graph first, the bottom two graphs. What the bottom graph shows is that because in 2000, the coverage of preescola was already very high amongst the richest, the coverage has increased in particular in Brazil for preescolar amongst the poorest. So there's been a reduction in the differences in attendance between the richest and the poorest in preescolar. But if you look at the top graph, it's exactly the opposite finding. In the top graph, what you see is that the increase in coverage in creches has been much larger amongst richer households on average than amongst poorer households. So the differences in coverage now in 2017-18 are larger, substantially larger than they were in, say, 2000. Okay? But then the question is, what do we know about whether it actually makes a difference to go to a creche or to preescolar in terms of what happens afterwards? In terms of creches, the evidence is very mixed. I'm asking the question, do children who go to creches do better on average than they would have if they had not gone to creches? Similarly, in preescolar, I'm asking the same question. A child, two identical children, one went to preescolar and one that did not. does the child who went to preescolar on average do better? That's the conceptual question here. On creches, we find that the ability to go to a creche substantially increases female employment. Mothers can now join the labor force because they have a place where they can leave their children. But in terms of the impact it has on children, in some cases, and I'll give you a couple of examples, we find positive effects, and in some cases we find no effects, and in some cases we actually find negative effects. Now I want to pause there for a second. You might think, how can you find a negative effect? A negative effect is that these children who go to creches are worse off in terms of their development than if they had not gone to creches. For that, it's important to think along the following lines. What is the quality of the environment these children would have had if they had not gone to creches? It's the quality of their home environment. So now you're taking these children out of the home environment and putting them in a different environment for a substantial part of their day, a creche. If on average, the quality of the creche, in terms of the environment, in terms of the attachment, in terms of the stimulation, is better than the quality of the home environment, these children will do better. But if on average, the quality of the creche is lower than the quality of the home environment, these children will do worse. So we've got a case in which public policy, if not designed correctly, can actually have perverse effects, right? You think, I'm building a creche in order to do better for these children, except often we don't think of that. We think, I'm building a creche to make sure that women can join the labor force. But in terms of child development, you're building a creche, and at least in some cases, if the quality is not sufficiently high, these children are now worse off in terms of their development than they would be if you'd never built a creche. So this is clearly something we need to worry about as public policy. So I want to talk a little bit about what quality is, because as I've said, clearly the challenge is quality, and in case you didn't get the message, I'll say the challenge is quality, and in case you didn't get the message, I'll say it a third time, the challenge is quality in these kinds of programs. Let's talk a little bit about quality. Quality in creches is normally thought of as having two different dimensions. One is structural quality, and one is process quality. So what is structural quality and what is process quality? Structural quality are the things that you can easily measure. And in fact, it's the things that traditionally we have measured as quality. And as I will show you, only focusing on this is a mistake. It's the quality of the infrastructure, the security of spaces for children, educational materials, things like how many children there are per teacher. Quality of processes does not focus on this. It focuses on what actually happens within the classroom. What is actually happening within the classroom. And it's obviously much harder to define and measure. The message I want to leave with you is improving structural quality will only result in better child outcomes if it helps improve process quality. Improving structural quality on its own does not improve child outcome. We have a lot of evidence of this. Improving structural quality only helps if it helps you improve process quality, but that doesn't happen by magic. It's not like, oh, I built a spanking new center and now everything is better, and I'll show you in fact evidence that it doesn't.